Imagine walking into a bank with nothing but an old sack on your back and boldly claiming, "This place belongs to me." People laughed, mocked, even called him crazy. But within minutes, that laughter would turn into silence and then into regret. This is the unbelievable true story of the old man with the sack and how he stunned an entire town. It was a busy morning at the town's largest bank. The building, with its high ceilings and polished marble floors, buzzed with the kind of energy you'd expect on a weekday. Customers formed lines that stretched almost to the glass doors, each person clutching forms, deposit slips, or checks. The sound of printers clicking, keyboards tapping, and hushed conversations created a steady hum that filled the air. Behind the counters, the bank staff worked quickly, their crisp uniforms and confident smiles designed to reassure every customer that their money was in safe hands. Everything seemed ordinary, predictable, even, but that was about to change. Suddenly, the glass doors swung open with a sharp push, and in stepped a figure who instantly disrupted the rhythm of the room. An old black man, his back slightly bent from years of labor, walked in carrying a massive, worn-out sack slung over his shoulder. The sack looked heavy, its faded canvas straps biting into his shoulder, but he carried it as if it were part of him. His clothes were plain and faded, his shoes scuffed and cracked, as though they had carried him through countless miles. A simple cap sat on his head, its brim shadowing his eyes that held the depth of many lived years, eyes that seemed to see more than most people around him could ever imagine. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A few customers in line shuffled uncomfortably, whispering to each other. He didn't look like the type of person you'd expect in a grand financial institution. He didn't walk in with a briefcase or in a suit. He walked in with a sack that seemed out of place in a world of polished desks, expensive pens, and glowing computer screens. But the man didn't hesitate. He didn't glance around nervously or fumble with his belongings. He walked with steady pace straight to the counter, where 5 employees sat in their neat uniforms, their faces plastered with professional smiles. When he reached the counter, he set his sack down on the floor with a heavy thud, leaned his elbow casually on the polished wood, and spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, firm enough to cut through the chatter of the entire room. "I'm here," he said, looking straight into the eyes of the nearest employee, "to claim what's mine, this bank." The words landed like a lightning strike. For a few long seconds, the room was dead silent. No one moved. No one breathed. The employees blinked, unsure if they'd heard correctly. Customers craned their necks, leaning in to see what had just happened. Even the security guard at the entrance raised an eyebrow, his hand instinctively brushing the baton at his side. Then, as if on cue, the silence shattered into an eruption of laughter. The bank staff, dressed in sharp suits and polished shoes, burst into fits of uncontrollable laughter. One young teller slapped the counter, so hard her pen rolled to the floor. Another clutched his stomach as tears formed in the corners of his eyes. One man in a tailored navy blue suit pointed directly at the old man and chuckled. "Did you hear that? He says he OWNS the bank." The sound of their laughter spread like wildfire. A woman waiting in line covered her mouth to stifle a giggle. A man near the back leaned toward his wife and whispered, "He must be out of his mind." Even a few security guards exchanged amused smirks, though they stayed in place, curious to see how the scene would unfold. The old man stood silently through it all, his face calm, unbothered. He didn't yell or try to explain himself. He just watched them, his eyes steady, as if he had seen this reaction before. His lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Not the smile of someone telling a joke, but the smile of someone who knew something others didn't. "Sir, do you even have an account here?" One of the women behind the counter said between fits of laughter, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Another added, "Maybe that sack is full of gold bars. Is that what you brought to buy the bank?" The group exploded again in laughter, some nearly falling out of their chairs. The scene turned into a spectacle. Customers who had come in to deposit checks or withdraw cash were now watching with wide eyes, their transactions forgotten. The bank, which had just moments ago been a model of professionalism and routine, now looked like a stage for mockery. But the old man didn't flinch. He reached down and patted the sack gently, almost like someone calming a loyal companion. Then, with the same calmness in his voice, he said, You can laugh all you want. But everything in here, the walls around you, the desks you sit at, even the money you count, it wouldn't exist without me." The laughter grew louder. One of the managers, a tall man with slick back hair, leaned against the counter with a smirk. "All right then, old man, if this is your bank, why didn't you go ahead and prove it?" The others chuckled again, but this time the laughter wasn't as full as before. There was something unsettling in the old man's tone, something that made even those who laughed the hardest glance at one another with unease. Still, the mood was mocking. They couldn't imagine, not for a second, that the man's words held any weight. To them, he was just another eccentric old-timer, someone out of touch with reality. But as the old man straightened up and prepared to unzip his sack, the air shifted. His calm confidence began to cast a strange silence across the room, a silence that made the laughter sound hollow, a silence that suggested their mockery might soon come back to haunt them. For in that sack, hidden beneath worn canvas and old zippers, was a truth that would not only wipe the smiles off their faces, but also change everything they thought they knew about the very bank they worked in. They thought he was crazy. A poor old man, with nothing but a sack, claiming ownership of a massive financial institution? Impossible. But little did they know, their laughter was about to turn into regret. The old man stood there quietly as the laughter rolled through the room like a wave. It echoed off the marble walls and bounced around the high ceilings, filling every corner of the bank. But he didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He didn't look embarrassed or angry. Instead, he just stood with a soft, knowing smile, his weathered hands resting gently on the sack at his side. His calmness only seemed to fuel the mockery. "Sir, do you even have an account here?" One young employee sneered, trying to hold back her laughter but failing. Her shoulders shook as she covered her mouth with a manicured hand. Another teller leaned over, grinning. "Maybe he thinks his sack is full of money. Maybe that's his evidence that he owns the bank." That made the others roar. They threw their heads back, tears forming in the corners of their eyes from laughing so hard. A few customers joined in, whispering to each other, their smirks barely hidden. Some shook their heads, pitying what they thought was just an old man gone senile. But through it all, the old man remained still, his smile steady. He tapped the sack lightly with his knuckles, the sound dull against the canvas. Then he looked directly at the row of laughing employees and said, in a voice calm but unshakable, "You all think this is a joke. But everything you see here, this building, the money, even your jobs, wouldn't exist without me." The room didn't quiet. In fact, his words only set off another wave of laughter. A woman in line giggled, whispering, "Maybe he built the place brick by brick." Another customer muttered, "Old folks come up with the strangest stories." The staff leaned against each other, tried to catch their breath from laughing so hard. One young man at the counter wiped tears from his eyes. "Sir," he said mockingly, "I think you've got the wrong building. The retirement home's down the street." More laughter. Louder, meaner this time. The employees weren't just amused anymore. They were entertained, feeding off each other's ridicule. The old man's eyes, however, remained sharp. He looked at each of them one by one, his smile widening ever so slightly. There was no bitterness in his face, only patience. The kind of patience that comes from someone who knows the ending of a story before anyone else does. That patience made one of the managers step forward. He was tall, sharply dressed, his tie perfectly knotted, his hair slicked back with expensive gel. He crossed his arms and leaned over the counter, smirking. "All right, old man," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "You've had your fun. Now prove it. Show us how you own this bank." He even made air quotes with his fingers. The other employees chuckled, encouraging him to push further. A few customers nodded, curious now, waiting to see how the strange scene would play out. The old man finally straightened up. His hand moved slowly, almost deliberately, to the zipper of his sack. The smile on his face grew wider, not playful, but certain. "You want proof?" he said softly, his voice steady enough to cut through the laughter. "Then I'll give you proof." He bent slightly, unzipped the heavy canvas sack, and pulled it open. The sound of the zipper, sharp and metallic, seemed to silence the room more than anything else had. Slowly, he reached inside. Every eye in the bank followed his movement. The laughter that had been so loud just moments ago now trickled into uneasy chuckles. Even the customers leaned forward, craning their necks to see. The sack, once the target of so much ridicule, suddenly carried an air of mystery. What was inside? Some expected junk, maybe old clothes or scrap metal. Others half expected him to pull out coins or something bizarre, adding fuel to the comedy of the moment. But the old man's hands didn't tremble. They moved with confidence, as though he had rehearsed this moment for years. One employee, still smirking, muttered under her breath, "This should be good." But as the old man's fingers closed around something inside the sack, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first. A hush fell over the room, as though everyone had suddenly remembered how quiet a bank was supposed to be. The laughter dried up, replaced by curiosity laced with a hint of unease. The old man paused for a moment, still gripping whatever was inside, then looked up at the staff and said, almost in a whisper, "Let's see if you'll laugh after this." With that, he slowly pulled his hand out of the sack, gripping the corner of a thick leather-bound book. Its cover was worn but elegant, the kind of book that didn't belong to everyday life. Dust clung to its surface, catching the light streaming in from the tall windows. The room froze. The employees' smirks faltered, their laughter caught in their throats. The manager who had demanded proof raised an eyebrow, his smug expression flickering with uncertainty. The old man set the book down on the counter with a heavy thud. Then, without a word, he reached back into the sack. This time, he pulled out a bundle of documents tied neatly with a faded ribbon. The edges of the papers were yellowed with age, but their seals and stamps were unmistakable, official, weighty, important. And just like that, the room that had been filled with ridicule only moments before fell into stunned silence. The laughter was gone. All that remained was the sound of the old man slowly untying the ribbon, preparing to reveal the truth that no one in the bank was ready to face. The mocking smiles faded one by one. For the first time since he had walked in, the old man had their complete attention. The bank, once filled with laughter and mockery, had gone quiet. All eyes were glued to the old man as he reached deeper into his sack and pulled out more than anyone had expected. First came the leather-bound books, thick volumes with cracked spines and covers worn smooth by time. They looked out of place on the polished counter of a modern bank, like relics from a forgotten era. When he set them down with a heavy thud, a small cloud of dust rose into the air, making the nearest teller cough nervously. Then came the bundles of documents. Each stack was tied carefully with faded ribbons, the paper yellowed at the edges, but still intact. Some bore seals pressed in wax. Others carried stamps from offices that hadn't existed in decades. And then, the most shocking of all, he laid out a collection of official-looking papers. Their ink faded but still legible. These weren't scraps of history. They were deeds, ownership titles, original charters, contracts, and signatures written in the careful script of men long gone. The laughter that had filled the room only minutes before began to die down. Nervous chuckles faded into silence. The employees leaned forward without realizing it, their smirks vanishing as their eyes scanned the papers in disbelief. One teller swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. What are those?" The old man straightened his back, his voice steady and calm. "This bank," he said, tapping one of the documents with a weathered finger, "was built on land that belonged to my family. My grandfather was one of the founding investors. He put up the land, he put up the money, and he trusted the men who stood beside him to honor that agreement." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the row of stunned employees before continuing. "These papers prove it. Every signature, every seal, every promise that was made. But over the years, the ownership was shifted quietly. Handshakes behind closed doors, documents hidden away, my family's name erased from the story. They took everything from us and left us with nothing." He placed his palm gently on the stack of documents. "But I kept every single record. And today, I'm here to claim what's rightfully mine." The words hung heavy in the air. The employees no longer laughed. Their eyes darted between the papers and each other, searching for an explanation, some reason to dismiss what was sitting right in front of them. But the stamps were there. The signatures were real. The documents looked older than any of them, yet they carried an authority that couldn't be denied. The manager, who had mocked him the loudest, reached forward with trembling hands and picked up one of the deeds. He examined the seal, tracing it with his finger. His confident smirk was gone, replaced by a pale, uneasy expression. These look real, he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for everyone to hear. The old man nodded. They are real. They've always been real. The only thing fake here, he said, his gaze sharp as he looked at the manager, is the story you've been told about who owns this bank. A murmur spread through the crowd of customers. People leaned closer, whispering to each other. Phones began to appear in hands, some customers secretly recording the moment, sensing history unfolding before their eyes. One bold customer finally spoke aloud. If this is true, then this man is the rightful owner. The employees shifted nervously. Their laughter, their arrogance, all of it had dissolved. Now they were caught between disbelief and fear. If this man was telling the truth, everything about their jobs, their authority, their bank could change in an instant. The manager flipped through more documents, his hands growing shakier with each page. He saw notarized seals, property lines that matched the very land the bank sat on, investment contracts signed by names that echoed to the town's history. These weren't counterfeits. They weren't clever tricks. They were legal, binding, undeniable. The old man's voice broke the silence again, calm yet powerful. You laugh because of what I wear. You laugh because of what I carry on my back. You thought this sack was filled with rags and junk. He patted the sack beside him, the sound echoing in the tense air. But this sack holds the truth. And the truth, he said, pausing long enough for every eye in the room to meet his, is that this bank has never stopped belonging to my family. Gasps rippled through the crowd. One of the younger tellers, who had mocked him earlier, covered her mouth with her hand, her cheeks burning with shame. The manager, still flipping through the papers, looked up at the old man, his voice unsteady. Sir, this could change everything. The old man smiled deep and not arrogant, but resolute. It will change everything. Because no matter how much time passes, no matter how many people try to bury the truth, it always finds its way back to the light. The bank that had once been filled with laughter was now wrapped in silence, so heavy you could almost hear the thud of every heartbeat. Employees who a moment ago had mocked him now looked at him with fear, awe, and respect. Customers stood frozen, realizing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. The sack, once ridiculed as a symbol of poverty, now stood as the vessel of justice. And the old man who had been dismissed as crazy now stood tall as the undeniable heir to everything inside those walls. The room that had once been filled with roaring laughter was now wrapped in an almost suffocating silence. The kind of silence that presses down on a room and makes every cough, every shuffle of feet, every whisper sound twice as loud. The employees who had laughed the hardest now sat stiffly behind the counter, their smiles erased, their eyes darting nervously from the old man to the stack of documents spread across the polished wood. They had mocked him, dismissed him, even ridiculed him. But now, none of them could meet his gaze. Customers, who only minutes earlier had whispered jokes at his expense, now whispered something else entirely. Their eyes were wide with disbelief. A mother leaned down to her teenage son and whispered, "Do you see what's happening? That man, he might actually own this place." A businessman near the back gripped his briefcase tighter, as though the weight of the moment was pressing down on him personally. The air was thick, heavy with tension. It was the kind of moment when everyone in the room knew that something big, something history-making, was unfolding right before their eyes. The manager, who had been the loudest in mocking the old man earlier, was now pale as a sheet. His throat was dry, but he forced himself to speak. He straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and tried to regain his composure. "Sir," he said, his voice shaky but dressed up in authority, "this is highly unusual. You must understand, we can't just take your word for it. We'll need to involve our legal counsel and perhaps even higher authorities." The old man didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply gave a slow nod, his face calm and unbothered. "Bring whoever you want," he replied evenly. "The truth doesn't need defending. It stands on its own." That one line sent a chill through the room. The confidence in his voice was unshakable, and it terrified those who realized they might soon be proven wrong. The next hour unfolded like a movie. Phones rang. Urgent calls were made. The manager, now sweating through his expensive shirt, spoke hurriedly into his phone, his voice low and tense. Lawyers were summoned, arriving with briefcases full of legal pads and laptops, their faces carrying the skepticism of professionals trained to doubt everything. But as the documents were laid out one by one, the skepticism melted away. The first lawyer adjusted his glasses and studied the deeds. He checked the seals, traced the signatures, and compared them with archived samples from the bank's founding documents. His expression shifted from doubt to shock, and then finally to grim acknowledgement. "These are authentic," he said quietly, almost reluctantly. The second lawyer flipped through the charters, checking dates and matching them with official records. He looked up, his brow furrowed. "This isn't just a claim. These papers show a continuous line of ownership that was never legally dissolved." The manager's face drained a color. He leaned forward, desperate. "Are you certain? There must be a mistake." But the lawyer shook his head. "There's no mistake. Whoever this man is, he has a rightful claim." The weight of those words hit the room like a hammer. Customers gasped. Employees froze. The old man stood quietly, his hands resting on the counter, watching with the calm patience of someone who had waited decades for this very moment. Every tick of the clock on the wall seemed louder now, each second dragging as the truth settled over the room. The employees who had laughed at him earlier now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One young teller who had mocked his sack clasped her hands together, her face burning red with embarrassment. Another employee stared at the floor, refusing to look at the old man at all. Their arrogance had evaporated, leaving only regret. A customer near the back whispered, "This is history. We're witnessing history." The old man finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension. "You see, all of you judge me by the sack I carried. You judge me by the clothes I wear. You thought I was nothing. But the truth has been here all along, waiting to be seen." His words echoed in the silence. No one dared to laugh now. By the time the lawyers had finished verifying every single page, the truth was undeniable. The sack of papers wasn't just old junk. It was a bank's forgotten history. It was the evidence that the foundation of the bank rested on promises made to his family, promises that had been buried, but never broken. The employees sat silently, their earlier confidence shattered. The customers, once amused, now looked at the old man with awe and respect. What had started as a joke had become one of the most shocking revelations in the bank's history. In the days that followed, the story spread across town like wildfire. What had begun as an ordinary morning at the bank had turned into the most talked-about event in years. Everyone knew about the old man with the sack, how he had walked in, been mocked and laughed at, and then stunned the entire building by proving his rightful ownership of the bank. Local newspapers picked up the story with headlines that captured people's attention instantly. The man with the sack who took back the bank. Forgotten history restored. Truth prevails after decades. From laughter to silence, the bank's shocking revelation. Soon, radio stations were discussing it. TV reporters camped outside the bank, hoping to get a glimpse of the mysterious man who had turned the financial world upside down. Videos recorded by customers during that fateful day circulated online, gathering millions of views. In them, the laughter of the staff could be heard at first, mocking, cruel, dismissive. Then came the silence, followed by the stunned faces as the truth unfolded. The contrast was undeniable, and people couldn't stop watching. For the employees who had laughed the hardest, the consequences were immediate. Some were reprimanded, others quietly let go, not because the old man demanded it. He never once called for revenge, but because the public embarrassment was too great for the bank's reputation to survive with those individuals still in uniform. Their mocking had been caught on camera for the world to see. The very arrogance they had worn so proudly became their downfall. But the old man himself took no joy in their downfall. He had not come for revenge. He had come for justice and for recognition of the truth. When he officially assumed his position as the bank's rightful owner, the atmosphere inside the building was completely different. The same employees who once looked at him with ridicule now stood with lowered heads, filled with respect and, in many cases, shame. Customers who had laughed now came forward to shake his hand, their voices carrying apologies and admiration. The grand lobby of the bank was filled with people on the day he gave his first speech as the new owner. Reporters lined the back, cameras flashing, microphones recording. Employees stood in rows, nervous and expectant. Customers crowded in, eager to hear what he would say. The old man stood at the front, dressed not in a fancy suit, but in the same simple style he had always worn. His sack, the same one that had carried the documents, was placed at his feet. He didn't need to change who he was to prove his worth. He looked out at the crowd with steady eyes, then began to speak. "Never judge a man," he said, his voice firm but warm, "by the clothes he wears or the bag he carries. Judge him by the truth he holds and by the strength of his spirit." The room was silent, every ear tuned to his words. "You laughed at me because I didn't look like you expected. You saw the sack on my shoulder and thought it meant poverty. You saw my worn shoes and thought they meant weakness. But what you didn't see, what you chose not to see, was the truth I carried, the truth that no amount of laughter could erase." He paused, letting his words sink in. Several employees shifted uncomfortably, tears brimming in their eyes. "Life," he continued, "has a way of turning laughter into lessons. The very moment you thought was a joke became the moment that revealed who you truly are. Some of you mocked me. Some of you doubted me. But the truth doesn't need your approval. It stands on its own, and in the end always wins." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound echoing through the bank's grand hall. Some clapped with tears in their eyes, moved by the humility and wisdom in his words. Even the employees who had mocked him joined in, their applause filled with remorse and respect. He smiled gently, lifting his hand to quiet the crowd before he spoke again. "This bank was built on promises. Promises made to families like mine. Promises that were forgotten, but never erased. Today, those promises are fulfilled, not because of wealth, not because of power, but because of truth. And let this be a reminder to every one of you. Never underestimate a person because of how they look. Never dismiss someone because they don't fit your idea of success. For one day, the very person you laugh at may be the one who teaches you the greatest lesson of your life." When he finished, the applause was thunderous. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and customers cheered. People who had once looked at him with disbelief now looked at him with admiration. And so, the old man with the sack, who had walked into bank as a joke in the eyes of many, walked out as a legend. His story became more than just a tale of ownership. It became a lesson etched into the hearts of everyone who heard it. A lesson about humility, truth, and the danger of judging by appearances. The very people who once laughed at him now stood in awe, realizing a truth they would never forget. Appearances can deceive, but truth always prevails. And from that day forward, whenever anyone in town passed by the grand building that now bore his name, they didn't see just a bank. They saw a story. They saw justice. They saw the man with the sack, who proved that sometimes the most ordinary-looking person can carry the most extraordinary truth.